We'll start now with the lecture day, and I'm privileged to invite Mr. Thomas Krummenacker. He is a journalist working for Reuters in Germany for nearly 20 years. He's an avid birdwatcher and a top photographer, and he will convene the morning session. So Thomas, please come on the stage, and we'll start now with the scientific lecture. Please, Thomas.
I'm not that big. I will make it very short. After all these very friendly and warm words of welcome here, I think we will start our conference immediately and dive deep into the subject now. I welcome the speakers of the morning. The keynote speaker of the morning is Professor Franz Bairlein. Franz is one of the leading experts of bird research of bird migration and migration ecology in various aspects. And he is the director of the Institute of Avian Research in Wilhelmshaven, to the Germans among us better known as Vogelwarte Helgoland. And it's very hard to list all the achievements and positions and functions he held. I want just to mention that among many other positions, Franz is currently the head of EURING, the European Union for Bird Ringing. I welcome as a second speaker Professor Pinkas Alpert, who will give us an outlook on the potential impacts of regional climate change on bird migration. Pinkas is chair professor in geodynamics at the Department of Geoscience here at Tel Aviv University. And he was also a member of the IPCC working group number 1 dealing with scientific aspects of climate change. The third speaker of the morning will be Dr. Leo Zwarts, I hope I pronounce it correctly, from the Netherlands. Leo is a leading expert in wetland ecology and wetland birds, and he is a co-author of the book Living on the Edge, Wetlands and Birds in a Changing Sahel, which is a really impressive balance of many years of fieldwork. This book was also awarded Best Bird Book of the Year in 2010 by the British Trust of Ornithology. So dear speakers, we are all very curious to hear your lectures. Franz, please, the floor is yours.
So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it's really a great honor to be invited, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. And I try to give you a little bit of a sketch of what we currently know about migratory birds in the wake of climate change. We have huge numbers of publications. Meanwhile, every hour, let me say, a new publication is appearing, and it makes it impossible to summarize them all. Therefore, I will depict a few cases only to sketch a little bit what we know, as already mentioned. And we know a lot. Migratory birds and climate change is an issue which is of subject, and it's very sexy at the moment. We have many fingerprints of climate change, which I will briefly summarize and then exemplify with a few cases. A lot of is discussed regarding the advanced spring arrival of many, many migrants. They arrive nowadays much earlier as compared to, let me say, 30 or 50 years ago. We have in some species delayed fall departure. They spend more time at the breeding grounds as compared to the past. And this may result in extended time at breeding grounds. It may result in more productivity because they have more time to lay eggs or to relay lost clutches. We have evidence that the number of species has been already addressed in the opening lectures, decreasing migratoriness, but this is currently in particular related to the within European migrants, not so much in the TransSaharan, in the tropical migrants. And the same is the case regarding a decreasing migration distance. We observe a number of species, I will give you examples in a minute, where we can already see now that they shorten their migratory distance between breeding grounds and their wintering grounds and vice versa. And we have a number of well-known range shifts regarding breeding ranges, but in particular non-breeding ranges, and for example cranes have been already mentioned in the opening speeches. So all these fingerprints are there, but what is wrong if a bird is arriving earlier? What? So does it matter what we observe? I guess the problem is that we do not really understand how functionally climate change influences migratory birds and birds in general. We need a much closer look on the functional properties. Only then we will be able to understand the consequences of these changes for the future of migratory birds, of biodiversity in general. I guess these are the key points we need to address, not just describing and monitoring forever. There are changes. We have to understand changes, and we have to understand the consequences of these changes. And so I would like to exemplify with a few cases. A lot has been published over the last couple of years regarding the so-called first arrival dates of observational data. So you can hear an incoming bird singing, and this is recorded. But do these first arrival dates really tell us a lot? Or what do they tell us about the population in general? They may be outliers, which is not properly considered. It's easy to record these early arrivals, but what do they mean? And I will give you two examples pointing on that problem. And the first one is showing you the relationship between first arrival date and the subsequent arrival dates. And as you can see, the predicted variation is declining very much. This means there's almost no significant relationship between a first arrival bird and subsequent arrivals. So subsequent arrivals obviously behave different from the first arrivals. First arrivals are in many cases these outliers, and we have to address again the question, how do they contribute, or do they contribute to the population? And another nice example is depicted from ringing data. And ringing data are really the value data we have in hand to analyze this kind of relationships. And this shows you for the pied flycatcher at a ringing station in southern Finland in the north, the advancement of arrival of different cohorts of that species, the pied flycatcher, over the years from 1970 to the 2000s. And as you can see here, with the first 5% of the arrivals, you see a very well developed and advanced and significant advancement of spring arrival. If it comes to the average of the population, there's almost no effect, and if it comes to the last part, there's absolutely no effect. So this tells we need to be very careful if it comes to an over-assessment of the first arrivals. We have to have a closer look on what the average of the population is doing, because this is the driving factor of population changes and not necessarily the first arrivals. And fortunately, there are a number of ringing stations in particular. This holds only for ringing stations, where we can analyze mean passage and not just the first arrival, as I mentioned already with the Euromos station. And my institute is harboring one of the long-term standardized data set we have on the globe on that issue, and therefore I would like to use that example and address a few of these questions. And this is related to the place where my institute got founded as Vogelwarte Helgoland Bird Observatory on the island of Helgoland, which is off coast, the German coast. It's situated in the southeastern part of the North Sea. It's a perfect place to study migratory birds, and in particular to study passage, mean passage, and not just first arrival dates, because we are running a so-called trapping garden already since 1911. And we are running that station or that trapping garden in a highly standardized protocol since 1961. Day by day, year by year, we are running the same protocol. And this is the best background data you can use to evaluate the effects, the long-term effects of, for example, climate change. We catch something like 15,000 birds a year in a good number of different species, and so we have proper sample sizes. The big advantage of that ringing station, that site, is on the island of Helgoland, that we do not have interference with local breeding land birds, because there are no local breeding land birds, almost no local breeding land birds on that island. So we can really study the passage and not interferences with local breeders. You, on land, on terrestrial habitats, you can't really separate. And if you then have a closer look, we have many of these cases. I exemplify with just these 6. The first 3 are depicting so-called within European migrants. They do not cross the Mediterranean in mass, they do not cross the Sahara to go to tropical Africa. In contrast to these 3 examples here in the bottom, with willow warblers, white-throat and pied flycatcher, these are the typical trans-Saharan migrants. And as you can see here, this is the spring migration date. It's a mean passage time. So this is, for example, starting with the 1st of January, the Julian date. This is around the last day of March. And as you can see, in all these 6 cases, and it counts for many other species as well, over the years from 1961 to now, we have a significant advancement of spring arrival. In contrast to what has been reported from first arrival dates, there's no difference at all between within European migrants and with trans-Saharan migrants. I will come back to that in a minute, because this addresses a question, which are the drivers? Because they are wintering in very, very different regions of the globe. If you have a closer look, then we can see that among the almost 25 species we have sufficient data available, that there is a significant advancement, a significant change over these last 50 years in most of these species except one, and it is significant in almost all. And it affects short-distance migrants or within European migrants in a similar way as compared to the long-distance migrants, which are already exemplified with the other slide. And this is again summarized, and I guess it's really important to address that there's no general difference between tropical long-distance migrants and the within European migrants, of course. So within European migrants arrive earlier, they pass Helgoland earlier, but the annual change, which is shown on the y-axis, does not differ between both groups. And this again then addresses the question, which are the drivers, because we have to understand why they behave so similar and they can't rely on the same drivers. And this is not just the case for the so-called Western Flyway, where we have these many data available. It's also the case for the Eastern Flyway, which is going across your country, across Israel. And this is depicted by, once again, data from a long-term ringing station. This is Rybaczy, where the Vogelwarte Radovcel has been founded many years ago, at the beginning of the last century, and they are continuing that work. They have more or less standardized trapping over the last 50 years as well. And again, you can see here that within European migrants like chaffinch and chiffchaff, as compared to the willow warblers and the pied flycatchers, the long-distance migrants, they are similar. So it looks like a general pattern, and we need to understand that general pattern to understand the driving factors beyond and as well of population changes. If it comes to autumn, the situation is much more complicated. There are species which advance or which depart earlier as compared to previous times, and there are others which delay their departure in autumn. So it's much less uniform as compared to spring migration. And this has consequences for the time the birds spend at the breeding grounds. And this could be depicted by slides like this one here, exemplifying for the willow warbler long-distance migrants and the chaffinch short-distance migrants migrating from Scandinavia to Central Europe and Southern Europe, but do not cross the Mediterranean. And as you can see in both species, and this again only a few cases out of the many others, you see a significant increase in the time these birds spend at the breeding grounds. So the length of the breeding season enlarges, is increasing. And this is likely to affect, positively influence the likelihood to breed at least once successfully, repeat a clutch, or even breed twice in a year. So we expect a higher productivity, and this is exactly what we learned from our trapping data on Helgoland, where we can see that over the last years, the productivity in some species is increasing, in particular within European migrants, but it's not changing or even decreasing in the long-distance migrants. And we are therefore confronted that dilemma, that conflict, let me say, that paradoxical situation that on the one hand we have indices and indication evidence that there is an increased productivity, but at the same time, in particular the long-distance migrants are declining rapidly since many, many years. And this is a lot of concern for us currently, and the already cited action plan Prof at the Quito conference, the CMS conference, is exactly to address that issue in more detail in a collaborative approach in the near future. So we are confronted, on the one hand, some beneficial changes regarding to climate change. At the same time, these birds are declining, and this is a challenge we have to address and to resolve. Despite or aside of the changes in phenology, we have these many other fingerprints of climate change in migratory birds as well. As I mentioned, in a number of species, here indicated by 4 of them, the lapwing, the black-headed gull, the European blackbird, and the starling. If we calculate the average migration distance for a period before 1980 and after 1980, for example, then you can see that they all shorten their migration distance. So these birds do not migrate that long distances as compared to previous times. So there is a decreasing migration distance, but as I mentioned, for the Western flyway, it's only the case in the European migrants. They may have this flexibility, while the long distance migrants with the Sahara as a particular obstacle in between do not have that flexibility. And on a long run, this may change the competition between short distance migrants within European migrants and long distance migrants. And that decreasing migration distance is indeed related to the climate situation in winter. Nowadays, we receive many more mild winters in Germany, and if you then plot, for example, for the common buzzard, the winter recoveries in mild winter, then you can see that most birds are recovered near the breeding grounds, are recovered in Germany, as compared to cold winters where birds are leaving the area and spend the winter further southwest. So there's indeed clear evidence that climate change, in particular the winter situation, is driving these decreasing migratory distances. At the same time, we are observing decreasing migratoriness, again in European migrants in particular. So for example, species like European robin, like blackcap, song thrush, dunnock, winter wren or chaffinch, chiffchaff, are nowadays wintering in huge numbers in Central Europe. They were not known in the past as wintering birds. They spent the normal winter or their winter normally in the Mediterranean region. And as a consequence of that, we observe changes in morphology if we address that at a particular site like Helgoland, where these birds are on passage. And this sounds a little bit counterintuitive. Over the years, we have good data over the last 20 years, we see an increase in the mean wing lengths of the birds, of European robins, as example, passing Helgoland. And this is not really plausible at the first glimpse. But what is happening? The European robin is a so-called partial migrant, where one part of the population is genetically a migrant and the other part is genetically a non-migrant, a resident. And what that figure is now depicting is a change in residency. Many more of the resident ones, the non-migratory ones, are now remaining, staying at the breeding ground in the north, in Norway and Sweden, and the proportion of the long-distance migrants, the migrants of the European robin with the longer wings, is still there, so there are migrants, and as a consequence, we see an increase in wing lengths as an indication of a change in increasing residency in a partial migrant. So, climate change is likely to change the migratory strategies, the behavior, the migratory behavior within populations, and this is what concerns us a lot, because it has consequences for intra-specific competition, and this has consequences for the population structure of these birds. And addressed already a little bit, we have quite a few examples of northward shifts of winter ranges. This is exemplified here with a tufted duck, where you can see the changes in the midwinter counts between 1980 and 2010, and you can see the arrows going down into southwest of Europe. They're going up, tremendously going up in the north, and this simply tells that these species are spent the winter further north as compared in the past, where they all wintered in the southwest of Europe. Now they are wintering in the north. So we have these many fingerprints, and again we have to address the question, what are the consequences? We could be happy as bird observers that many more birds spend the winter with us in the north, but is that what we really aim to do? And which are again the consequences? And so I would like to depict a little bit again this example and asking a better understanding of the drivers behind these different scenarios. Also, they are behaving so similar, but the drivers must be different. And this is what we try to analyze by first of all looking on local temperature. Local temperature is depicted here for Germany over the last 200 years, more or less, or 150 years. And you can see here that there is nowadays a significant increase in temperature, in average temperature in Germany. This is what we know very well from the climatologists. So local temperature could be one driver, and this is what migrants, short distance and medium distance migrants, which spend the winter within Europe, may catch and may use in their decision, let me say, more or less. But on the other hand, we have a driver of climate change which works on a much larger scale, and this is a so-called North Atlantic Oscillation. Basically, the North Atlantic Oscillation is the engine of our Western European and Northern European weather situation. It has less influence as the further east we go, but nevertheless, we have basically two different phases of that North Atlantic Oscillation. One is depicted with a minus, the other one is a plus. And the minus one is the one which we learned in our textbooks of climate in general, and it means that in winter it rains in the Mediterranean and the winters in the north should be dry and cold. So this is a situation we were used in the past. Meanwhile, we have many more of these cases where the winters in the Mediterranean are getting drier and drier, and it gets milder and wetter in the north. So factors are changing, and the North Atlantic Oscillation, it could be depicted by the so-called North Atlantic Oscillation Index, is changing. As you can see here nowadays, in recent decades, we are confronted many more years with these positive NEO, so with changed climatic conditions as compared to the past. Do these two drivers really affect our migrants? Yes, they do, but in a different manner. First of all, I plotted here for two species, the European robin as a short distance migrant, so within European migrant, and the white-throat as a Trans-Saharan migrant, their annual arrival date, which are these dots. Once again, this is arrival date in spring. So for example, here we are at the end of March, this is the end of May, for example. We can see that the short distance migrants, so within European migrants, react significantly on that local temperature change. So they take the information from the local change and they react on that. In contrast to the Trans-Saharan migrants, where that relationship is not existent, it does not show a significant relationship. If we then take into consideration the North Atlantic Oscillation Index, then we see exactly the opposite. The short distance migrants do not respond to changes in the North Atlantic Oscillation, while the long distance migrants are driven by that environmental change, by the NOAA. And this tells that we could have the same phenomenon, but different drivers. And if we are going to understand in a functional relationship, we need to know which is driving which behavior. And it's not just temperature and North Atlantic Oscillation. If we depict from the most recent IPCC report the global rainfall pattern and the change in rainfall, the change in annual precipitation over the last 50 years, then you can see there are areas, in particular in the Mediterranean, which I already mentioned, which are getting drier, which are getting much less rain, and in particular areas where later on Leo will tell more about in Africa. And this has consequences as well. Once again, depicted, exemplified by data from the Rybachy station in the Kury Spit area in northwestern Russia. And as you can see here, there's a close relationship between the arrival dates of these long-distance migrants which spent the winter in Africa down here in the tropical area. Willow warble, pipefly, catch a lesser white-throat, icterine warbler. You can see if it's wet, if there's a lot of rain in Africa, they arrive later as compared to years when in Africa rainfall is tiny, is small. And this addresses the question of carryovers. It does not necessarily mean that first arriving birds in such years are in best condition. They may even the ones, because of poor feeding conditions in the south, which arrive in bad conditions for subsequent breeding. And we have these many carryover effects, and I'm sure Leo will tell you a little bit more on that in a minute. So we have to address carryovers, effects which are working on a place far outside the breeding range, but likely to influence the breeding success, the productivity, the reproduction at the breeding ground. And this needs to be identified, and this again addresses the question, which are the consequences of these changes if it comes to a better understanding. And by that I jump into a relationship which is important to depict. This is climate change effects on breeding. First of all, we have to know that by evolution, a breeding season, here for example in tits, is set in a way that birds are in a seasonal manner in the nest where food is available for the parents to feed their young. This is how selection worked for shaping the migration season. We know that birds which arrive earlier, this is depicted here in one case from the American red start, we have many other examples, the birds, the females which are arriving earlier, this again the day of the year, they start breeding earlier. If they arrive late, they start late with breeding. So this is a fixed process, more or less, in these birds. And this has consequences. It leads to a shift in the nestling period of these birds. So for example, there's an advancement due to earlier arrival. As a consequence, or if then the food, the insect, is shifting in a similar pace, then it doesn't matter, because there's still a synchrony between the birds and the availability of food to raise these birds successfully. But this is not the case as shown by a very nice meta-study of British colleagues. They summarized all available data on spring changes of phenology, which is the seasonal occurrence of events. And they separated in various trophic levels. These are the vertebrates, these are basically the birds, these are the insects, this is the food, and the green bar is showing the advancement in the plants. So for terrestrial habitats, birds are later than the development of insects because the development of plants is so fast, so much advanced. This means there's a mismatch between these events. But this is not uniform across all ecosystems. If it comes to freshwater, for example, it's exactly the opposite. Where birds are arriving, the vertebrates are much more advanced in spring as compared to their food and as compared to the plants. So there is a mismatch. And this is exactly what addresses the problem. And it has been already addressed in one of the opening speeches. Because in many cases in terrestrial habitats, where our birds are breeding basically, in particular songbirds, we do have a much more advanced appearance of food, of the insects, but we still have a less advanced reaction of the birds, and this leads then to what we call mismatches. So early arrival and early breeding does not necessarily mean that they have a higher breeding success. Exactly the opposite could be the case, and this is then a driving factor for population changes. And this has been depicted in a meta-study analyzing 117 different European species, where we do have enough data to relate the mismatch So, which means asynchrony between the timing of the nestlings in the nest and the food supply for these different species. And if you then plot the extent of that mismatch on the x-axis, on the y-axis, the population trend, which means species, all these symbols depict a species, a single species. The ones above this line are increasing population over the 25 years, and these ones here are decreasing. As you can see, the more the mismatch is pronounced, the more extended mismatch is, the more the populations are declining, are in decrease. And this tells how important it is to have a closer look to this relationship, to the functional relationship, and not just describing climate changes in general. And there's another variation which concerns me a lot, and it has been fortunately addressed as well in some of the opening speeches, and this is regional variation in climate effects. We are discussing so much about global issues. That's boring. That's not really the problem. The problem are regional effects, existing ones as well as the ones which are predicted for the future. Because this brings birds, migratory birds, in huge conflicts. Normally, these migratory birds are relying on a set of resources they need along their migratory routes, either in autumn or in spring, irrespective whether they go the western route or the eastern route, whatever we take. But with this regional variation, these birds are confronted an asynchrony of regional availability of resources, for example, of food and resting sites. And so we are likely to observe mismatch in space and time, and this may have very considerable effects on the migratory birds. And I would like to depict that with a species. You are not very common here with that. These are Arctic geese. Arctic geese are wintering near the Wadden Sea area, which has been mentioned earlier, and they are very common there. They spend the winter with us in northern Germany, in Netherlands, and in Denmark. And these birds follow very strictly a genetic timing of their migration. They have basically a wintering area, which is the Wadden Sea. They have one or two, normally one staging area, stopover area in the area here in the eastern Baltic, and from then they jump in one flight to the breeding range in the northern Russian Arctic. They rely on body reserves they build on during migration for successful breeding in the Arctic. So these birds are fixed by their migratory schedules. Basically, they follow what we call a green wave. They are in synchrony. Their endogenous migratory timing program is in synchrony with the availability of feeding conditions en route from the wintering area in the Wadden Sea across the Baltic, and then they arrive in time for successful breeding in the Arctic. But what is now happening with regional variation in climate change, and this is depicted by temperature. Currently, we observe a much more advanced spring in the Wadden Sea as compared to the Baltic, and currently there's no significant change in the Arctic. And what is the consequence? The consequence is that these birds are coming out of synchrony with availability of feeding opportunities. They still have good conditions in the Wadden Sea. They take advantage, then they build up their reserves, they start migration, this is fixed, they arrive more or less already too early at the staging grounds, then they are driven. Also, they may not be able to fulfill their requirement, but they are driven by an internal timing mechanism to proceed with migration. This is endogenous structured, and so they arrive in the Arctic well ahead of availability of food, and this results in a decreasing breeding success, and this is what has been already observed in a number of cases. So this is what we are challenged regarding migratory birds. It's not just the phenology changes, it's basically a mismatch in space and time. But it's even more complicated. We recently discovered a so-called nutritional mismatch. You may not wonder what that means. That means basically that these birds do need two fuels for migration, that is basically fat for migration, and they build on protein research for successful breeding in the Arctic. They are so-called capital breeders, which means they rely on condition they take over from the wintering grounds to the breeding grounds to be able to breed successfully. So this is the background story. What is now happening in the wake of climate change, in the light of climate change? We have to know that geese species and many other species are very selective regarding their dietary selection. They do not eat all what is available. They select very precisely according to the protein content, because they need that protein, and the fat content, because they need it for migration. So these are the two drivers these birds select, like this food item here, but not this one here. So they are very selective. What is the consequence of climate change? Climate change is linked to a CO2 increase, and CO2 increase is a very beneficial issue regarding plant growth, because the biomass is increasing. Due to higher CO2, this is well shown in greenhouse experiments, and it's shown in reality as well if it comes to agricultural practices. There's an increase in biomass. So on the first glimpse, it looks like that the feeding conditions for the geese are improving. But at the same time, with increasing CO2, the protein content per gram eaten food is declining. And this is then a conflict for these birds. They can get more food, but they can't process too much food in the stomach. They are limited, physically limited, but they get less protein-rich food. And another item is related to the so-called secondary plant compounds. Secondary plant compounds are basically defending agents of plants to avoid grazing of herbivores. And these secondary plant compounds have a very nice relationship to temperature. So for example, in the tropics, in the savanna area, for example, the grass species there contain much more of the secondary plant compounds as compared to the northern grasses. And these secondary plant compounds affect the feeding opportunities for these birds. If we supplement, in an experiment with Canada geese, if we supplement the food with secondary plant compounds, you can see that even tiny amounts of added secondary plant compounds to the food of these Canada geese, immediately these birds stop feeding. They do not like to eat grass or plants which are rich in secondary compounds, because that's dangerous for them as well. If it comes to the temperature relationship, that's what I already addressed. With increasing temperature, the secondary plant compound composition is increasing. The content is increasing. And this is now confronting these birds a so-called nutritional mismatch, because on the one hand there's an increasing availability of biomass to eat, to forage on, but there's a decreasing quality of the food, and the digestibility or the attractiveness of the food is declining as well, because of the increased secondary plant compound in these plants. And this results in nutritional bottlenecks. These birds are continuously facing a problem that they cannot put on enough protein and enough fat for subsequent migration and subsequent successful breeding in the Arctic. So this will affect migratory performance, not timing, but migratory performance, and of course breeding success. So there are a number of hidden effects regarding climate change in migratory birds. Only a few I was able to depict here, otherwise I can entertain you for the next couple of hours. But there's another hidden effect we really need to address, and which is not much in focus in the recent debates. And this is renewable energy development. If it comes to wind, in some places we are confronted with collisions. But what is even a much bigger effect, these are the so-called barrier effect, where birds avoid these plants. They try to detour, but they may run out of energy to detour these huge plants. So even collision might be a very low issue. It's a very emotional one, I understand. But collisions in many cases is not the issue. There are exceptions, of course. But it's a barrier effect. if it comes to solar energy use, we are confronted on the one hand that these huge panel plants need land. So it eats land we need for nature conservation. And we have some first evidence that these huge shining fields here are disturbing migratory birds because they change the environment significantly. And another issue which is currently much debated, in particular in Germany, is the use of biofuel. And biofuel is eating up land. Therefore, we need to be very concerned about the dilemma, which has been already addressed, between climate change mitigation and nature conservation. Because this is all climate change mitigation, and it's good that we started to develop, but the coin has two sides, and we have to address the effects on wildlife, on nature as well, and not just having in mind the carbon footprint. So, coming to the end, migratory birds and climate change. What needs to be the next steps? It's a lot of understanding. We need to understand the functional relationships. I tried to show you with that nutritional aspects, mismatches in various kinds. We need to understand the connectivity if it comes to an understanding of the regional effects of climate change on migratory birds. We have to know where these birds spend the winter. We have to know where these birds pass and where are the key stopover sites. We have to identify them. And then, as I addressed already, we need to understand these carryover effects. I depicted that for the rainfall relationship with the European migrants in Africa and with the geese study regarding the carryovers between wintering area and subsequent breeding. It's not just that they survive the winter, they even prepare themselves for the north. And this is exemplified in the white stork and the European white stork as well, where we are able to show that the breeding success of white storks in Germany is linked to the feeding conditions in Africa, where they gather the protein reserves, in particular again, like the geese, for subsequent breeding in the north. So carryovers is a key stone, a key factor we need to address. We have to understand side effects of climate change mitigation. This is what I mentioned or tried to show with the renewable energy issue. And we need to understand the so-called adaptability. How fast can animals or plants adapt to climate change? Climate change is a long-term process. Even if we would stop immediately all our carbon burning, we would have a delayed effect of many, many decades. So for the future of wildlife, the future of birds, it depends on understanding of adaptability, how environment is influencing genes and vice versa. And this means we have to give the birds space, time and space to be able to adapt. And therefore, climate change in migratory birds is now a sexy issue. But the most driving factors, the driving factor which are most important for migrants is preserving habitats for the present and for the future. And again, not just at the breeding grounds where we invest a lot. We have to have in mind passage and stopover, for example in Israel, and of course we have to see what's going on in the far distant wintering areas. This is, I guess, what's really important. We should not take the climate change issue to detour the real effects on other levels, and habitat protection, habitat preservation is a key factor for the future of our migrants. But of course there are effects of climate change as well we have to be concerned about anyhow. In this way, thank you very much for your attendance.